So welcome back, and let's have a look at transitioning into ETCS, but this time into level 2. So what triggers level transitions? Well, it is a command from the trackside, and that command includes a priority table. And it's up to the onboard to select the highest available entry in the list. So where do we transition? Well, we can design it to occur virtually anywhere. But if we're looking at level NTC, that's your older Class B system, to level 2, then probably a good place would be either at a signal or, of course, the alternative, between signals. And in making those decisions, we need to consider the normal integrated operations. So at level 1, the transition occurs based on a message received from a police group, and the transition occurs there. But for level 2, we need to do some things on the approach. So the actual transition to level 2 is indicated by a level transition order transmitted from a Belize group. However, before we get there, we need to have the radio system working. So the first Belize group we encounter is one to register the GSMR system on the correct network. Now, this particularly applies if you could have trains operate in different countries. In the UK, because all of the trains operate on the same network, the network registration Belize group can be omitted. Once the GSMR has registered onto the correct network, a little bit like when you switch on your mobile phone and it takes a moment or two to find whichever your provider is, then the next thing is to establish a session. This is a little bit like establishing a phone call on your mobile phone. The ETCS onboard will contact the relevant RBC, and the RBC details are contained in the message from the Belize group with the command to establish the session. And normally you would also want to announce that you're going to transition. This gives the driver some advance notice of what is going to happen. And again, this could be done through a Belize group. So we have a series of Belize groups. Now, each of these activities can take a period of time, and it's typical to allow about 40 seconds for the network to register and another 40 seconds for a session to be established. It's normally a lot faster than that, but by allowing those times, it means that each stage of the process has happened before you try and do the next stage. And once the session is established, then you will expect that the RBC will send a movement authority to the train. It'll quite often be around about the same place as the transition is announced, in this case by a Belize group. And so why not get rid of that Belize group and actually use the RBC to announce the transition? That has the advantage that the transition is only announced when the movement authority is also available. The transition announcement will replace the transition order if the transition order is missed for any reason. Perhaps the Belize has failed. By announcing a transition in advance, we have an option to ask the driver to acknowledge the transition before they actually get to the border. Not every transition needs to be acknowledged by the driver, but where it does, the default is that it is requested immediately that the transition occurs and the driver has 5 seconds. However, if you have got the announcement, you can specify that you want the acknowledgement to start before you reach the border, and that gives the driver more notice and more time. So let's have a look at what happens if the transition is not at a signal. Here we have our train on the left, and it will pass along the route, reading the network registration and the session establishment. And once it's established a session, then the RBC can send it a movement authority and a transition announcement. This all works quite nicely. The signal is green, and so the train will be able to proceed. It will get the announcement displayed to the driver, then the acknowledgement, transition, and the movement authority will then become active. But what happens if that signal was at red? Well, our train will proceed. It will still get the registration, and it will still establish a session. However, because there is no aspect available, then the movement authority cannot be issued, and nor can the level transition announcement. Once the signal does clear to green, a short while afterwards, then the transition announcement and the movement authority will be transmitted. Now, in this example, the acknowledgement for the level transition order is some distance after the signal. But if the level transition is quite close and you have a standard 20-second or so running time acknowledgement window, then it may mean as soon as the signal clears, the movement authority and transition announcement are issued, that the driver is asked to acknowledge the transition even before he starts or she starts away from the signal. And what could go wrong with this? Well, let's just have a look at a situation where the train fails to connect. The signal's green, the driver continues. The transition will occur to level 2 due to the transition order, and the answer will be the train will trip. And this has happened on one of our implementations in the UK, and is one reason why we tend not now to place the transition into an ETCS level 2 only area in the middle of a section. We tend to put it at a signal. So let's have a look at that. So with the transition to the signal, in this case the signal red, as the train proceeds, again it will establish its session and it will attempt to contact the RBC. Because the signal is at red, no movement authority or level transition announcement will be made. However, once the train has made communication, we can actually now send the movement authority and that transition announcement before we clear the signal. And we can use the fact that the message is acknowledged to enable that signal to be cleared. So we now know that the train will be brought to a stand by the normal train protection systems and the red signal before the transition, unless it's got a movement authority. So the green signal prevents the train going into the ETCS area and transitioning unless it has got a movement authority. And in a degraded situation, the train would proceed up to the red signal and stop. And after a period of time, the driver would contact the signaller to get authority, and they would then select the ETCS override. So even though they haven't yet entered the ETCS area, they can still select the ETCS override. And having done that, when the train does transition to level 2, as it passes the red signal and reads the level transition order from the Belize group, then it will automatically go into staff responsible and it won't trip. So that's just an example of how you can lay out different transitions into level 2. And we are looking at a level 2 only area, an area where the line side signaling system is no longer available. If, of course, you mix level 2 and non-level 2 operation in the same area, then the arrangements at the borders become a little bit more complicated. So I hope that's given you an insight into transitions into a level 2 area.